February 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. From the east, the Red Army floods toward Berlin. From the west, the Allies breach the Rhine. And yet Heinrich Himmler, the most feared man in Nazi Germany, believes he can still turn the tide of war. This is the story of a doomed offensive, a desperate counterattack planned not by a general, but by a man obsessed with power and illusion. It was called Operation Solstice Sonnenwende, the winter solstice, the last gamble of Heinrich Himmler. By early February 1945, Germany was a nation in ruins. The Red Army had smashed through Poland and East Prussia, crossing the Oder River only 70 kilometers from Berlin. For the first time, Soviet artillery shells could be heard in the German capital. At Hitler's headquarters, chaos reigned. Generals argued. Hitler raged, and Himmler, now commanding Army Group Vistula, faced a task for which he was completely unqualified. Archival maps showing the Oder River, Berlin, and Pomerania, footage of bombed-out German cities. Army Group Vistula was a Frankenstein force, an unholy mix of exhausted Wehrmacht units, teenage conscripts, and the remnants of shattered divisions retreating from the east. Himmler's command post was at Schneidemühl, today's Piła, in Poland, a world away from the front lines. But despite the hopeless situation, Hitler demanded a counterattack to stop the Soviets. Cold, he wanted another miracle like the Ardennes offensive in the West just 2 months earlier, and Himmler promised to deliver it. Himmler called his operation Sonnenwende Solstice. Its goal, to relieve the besieged fortress of Kustrin and push the Soviets back from the Oder. In theory, it would also buy time to strengthen Berlin's defenses. But in reality, Sonnenwende was doomed before it began. Visual cue: Himmler inspecting troops, military staff bent over maps in candlelit bunkers. The offensive relied on 3 panzer corps, but only one of them, the 11th SS Panzer Army, even existed on paper. The rest were skeletal formations scraped together from training schools, naval units, and Luftwaffe ground crews. The main strike force was led by one of Germany's most capable generals, Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, who tried desperately to save what little remained of the Wehrmacht's dignity, but his authority clashed constantly with Himmler's paranoia. Himmler spent more time giving ideological lectures than issuing military orders. He even summoned astrologers to assure him that the stars favored victory. By mid-February, the troops assembled in the Pomeranian countryside, the last open plain before Berlin. Snow covered the fields, temperatures dropped below freezing, and thousands of men, many barely 17, waited in foxholes and trucks, clutching outdated rifles and Panzerfausts. Visual cue: German soldiers trudging through snow, frozen roads littered with abandoned vehicles. Among them were the 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, the 5th SS Wiking, and a few Tiger tanks from the Heavy Panzer Battalion 503. Elite names on paper, but shadows of their former strength. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was low, and the enemy Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front was entrenched, reinforced and vastly superior in both manpower and armor. Still, on February 15th, the order came down: attack at dawn. At first light, the German guns opened fire. The frozen air shook with the roar of artillery. Explosions across snowy plains, T-34s moving through smoke. The 11th SS Panzer Army surged forward from Stargard toward Arnswald, smashing into Soviet lines. Caught off guard, the Red Army reeled back under the initial blow. German tanks, Panthers, and Tigers rolled across the icy roads, their cannons tearing into Soviet armor. For a moment, it seemed as if the impossible had happened. The Soviets were falling back. Towns were retaken. German soldiers cheered, but it was only an illusion. Behind the Soviet front lines, entire armies waited in reserve. Marshal Zhukov had predicted the counterattack, and he was ready. Within 48 hours, Soviet reinforcements struck back with overwhelming force. By February 17th, Operation Solstice was collapsing. German fuel convoys were ambushed. Tanks ground to a halt on empty roads. Infantry units, cut off and encircled, fought desperately to break free. Footage of destroyed German columns, abandoned tanks frozen in snow. At Arnswald, surrounded SS units refused to surrender, fighting until their last round. The town became a graveyard of burning tanks and shattered hopes. Meanwhile, Himmler sat miles behind the front in his command bunker, refusing to believe the truth. He issued orders no one could carry out, demanding that the attack continue at all costs. When Guderian confronted him, the exchange was explosive. The old general accused Himmler of incompetence. Himmler, furious, accused Guderian of defeatism and cowardice. Within days, Guderian went directly to Hitler, begging to have Himmler dismissed. On February 20, 1945, Himmler was relieved of his command. His grand Operation Solstice had achieved nothing except to waste thousands of lives. Himmler walking out of headquarters, exhausted German troops trudging through snow toward Berlin. In just 5 days of fighting, the Germans lost over 8,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and their last chance to hold Pomerania. The Red Army resumed its advance, now unstoppable. Himmler returned to Berlin, humiliated and broken. He would never command troops again. But the price of his arrogance was paid in blood by the very men he claimed to serve. In the weeks that followed, the Soviet steamroller crushed the last German resistance in Pomerania. Cities like Stargard, Kolberg, and Kozlin were overrun one by one. Tens of thousands of civilians fled westward through blizzards and chaos, seeking refuge that no longer existed. Visual cue: columns of refugees pulling carts, burning villages, the frozen Baltic coast. By March, what remained of the German army in the region was surrounded near Danzig and the Baltic coast. It was the same story everywhere: shattered units, hopeless orders, and senseless deaths. For the soldiers who had fought in Operation Solstice, there was no redemption, only retreat, and the endless sound of Soviet artillery growing louder each day. Himmler's fantasy world. While the front disintegrated, Himmler lived in a world of fantasy. He still told subordinates that miracles were coming, that Hitler would unleash a secret weapon, that destiny itself was on their side. But even within the Nazi hierarchy, his reputation had collapsed. The generals despised him. Hitler no longer trusted him. And as the Red Army neared Berlin, Himmler quietly began to plan for his own survival. Himmler in uniform staring at maps, then archival footage of Berlin in ruins. He met secretly with intermediaries to open peace. Talks with the Western Allies, the same man who had built concentration camps now sought mercy for himself. Was the ultimate betrayal of the regime he had served fanatically for 12 years. Operation Solstice had been meant to restore German pride and prove Himmler's genius as a commander. Instead, it exposed his delusion and incompetence for all to see. The offensive bought Hitler only a few weeks' time that meant nothing in the grand collapse of the Third Reich. By April, the Soviets were inside Berlin. By May, the war was over. Red Army soldiers raising flags over ruins, German prisoners marching in surrender. Himmler went into hiding under a false name, Heinrich Himmler. Captured by the British near Bremervörde, he took his own life by biting on a cyanide capsule. For all his power, cruelty, and ambition, Himmler's final act was one of cowardice. Just like his last operation, it ended in failure. Today, few remember Operation Solstice. It was small compared to the battles of Stalingrad or Kursk, but its symbolism runs deep. It was the moment when faith replaced reason, when ideology drowned out strategy. A war already lost continued only to feed the pride of broken men. Black and white footage fades into modern-day forests and fields in Poland, silent and snow-covered. The frozen plains of Pomerania are quiet now, but beneath that soil lie the remains of thousands of soldiers and civilians alike, sacrificed for a dream that had already turned to dust. And at the center of it all stood one man, Heinrich Himmler, the bureaucrat of death who fancied himself a general, and who led his men not to glory, but to oblivion. This was Operation Solstice, Himmler's last gamble. Thank you for watching.